Welcome to the Interpreting for BES. The information contained in this BES should be considered and remain confidential. This BES will contain 3 parts: English to ASL, ASL to English, and side translation. Part 1, English to ASL, Expressive Interpreting. For this part of the BES, your audience prefers a more ASL-like delivery. You will be interpreting for an educational parent advocate, Amanda Morin. She will be outlining the standards with an IEP and a 504, including accommodations and modifications.
There are many differences between an IEP and a 504 plan. The first and most fundamental is they're governed by different laws. An IEP is governed by a special education law. 504 is governed under a civil rights law. And that makes a difference in what kinds of services and how an IEP plan and 504 plan come together. To qualify for an IEP, you have to have one of 13 specified conditions or disabilities that are written in the law. For example, specific learning disability, which would be something like dyslexia, would be a condition that a child would qualify for an IEP under. Having one of those 13 identified disabilities isn't enough to make sure your child gets an IEP. Whatever is going on with your child, whatever that disability is, also has to affect his performance in the classroom. And that's really important to know, because sometimes parents think that just having a disability qualifies for an IEP. But you also need to make sure that it's making a difference. It has what's called educational impact, adverse impact in the classroom for how your child's learning. For a 504 plan, a child needs to have a disability that is getting in the way of his learning in the general education classroom. The difference isn't that he needs specialized instruction, it's that he needs some changes to get benefit from his education the same way as other kids in that classroom. And so kids who have ADHD often have 504 plans, and what happens is just changes are made to the environment, and those changes are called accommodations. And those changes are made in the general education classroom and don't require specialized instruction. So for example, a child with ADHD may need extra time to work on a test or to get his homework done. So some people are concerned that a 504 plan isn't as good as an IEP. And the truth of the matter is that a 504 plan or an IEP can meet your child's needs. It just depends on how well it's put together. A well-written, well-implemented plan that everybody knows what's going to be happening and in place and is working on it can be very helpful for a child who doesn't need that specialized instruction. As long as there's a lot of follow-through and everybody's checking in to make sure it's working well, a 504 plan can be very helpful for kids in the classroom. Once you've qualified for an IEP or 504 plan, there are a number of things that can provide for your child. It can provide accommodations and modifications. An accommodation changes how your child is learning. A modification changes what your child's learning. So, for example, if you think about a child who needs eyeglasses to see, those eyeglasses are an accommodation to help him see better. Now, that's not an accommodation for a learning disability, but it's an example of how you can change how your child's learning versus what they're learning. If your child needs that extra time, that's an accommodation. He's learning the same information, but he's getting a little extra time to do it. A modification changes what your child is learning. So, for example, if your child has trouble reading on the same grade level as his peers, he can get the same information but in a lower reading level, and that's a modification to what he's learning. If you think your child needs an IEP or a 504 plan, the first thing you want to do is you want to talk to the teachers. But make sure you've documented your concerns. Write down specific things that you're worried about. Keep track of your child's progress in schoolwork. Say, these are the things I'm seeing at home. Can you tell me what you're seeing in the classroom? How are we working around them now? What's working, what's not working? And then you need to put in what's called a formal request for evaluation. And this is really important. If you want to get an IEP or 504 plan in place for your child, write a letter stating your concerns and saying, I want to make sure that my child is going to be evaluated. And you need to turn that into the administrator of your child's school, which is usually the principal. And that will start the ball rolling. And after that, what happens is there's an evaluation process, and your child will be evaluated and tested, and all of his strengths and needs will be looked at. And then you'll sit down with all of his team members, which would be his teacher and the principal and all of the other people who are involved in this process, and decide what the next steps are.
This concludes Part 1. Part 2, ASL to English, Receptive Interpreting. For this part of the BES, your audience prefers a more English-like delivery. You will be interpreting for Neil McDivitt. He works for the NAD. He is the chair for the Emergency Expert Group. Today, he will be speaking about emergency preparedness and the impacts to the deaf community.
Hi there, my name is Neil McDivitt, and I'm the chair of Emergency Management Group for the NAD. Our group was given the job to examine many of the challenges that deaf and hard of hearing people face in emergency management, preparedness, and emergency responses. Some of the challenges included access to emergency warnings. There were none of those. If mayors or governors had speeches or press conferences or just sharing information, interpreters or no closed captions were provided. Access to local help for health recovery in disaster situations were not there either. Maybe they wanted to go to a training and they didn't have access to that as well. The NAD group of experts in deaf and hard of hearing management for emergency situations requested us to develop a position statement. My goal for us and just have key information that they can use to have greater access to all these things that I just mentioned. At the same time, we want to make sure that documents for emergency management situations can be understood and translated to get that concept for the training and be useful for our deaf and hard of hearing community. So one topic that I noticed emergency management organizations do not have funding for disabled access, and I suggest that they should set that up, have some funds that they put aside for that purpose specifically. Also, they must include the deaf and hard of hearing community in their plans, meetings, in your agency plans, and any discussions of policies and procedures must include that community in that process as well. The next one is they need to set up a process for getting interpreters for press conferences. Anytime that happens in that kind of situation, for instance, governor or mayor or chief and so forth, they give a presentation to the community, the interpreter should be there next to them. And they need to make sure that the interpreter can be seen by the TV and by the camera. Most of the time the interpreter is there, but the shot is zoomed in only on who is presenting and who is talking. And the interpreter is not in the shot, so you can't see them. In emergency management, broadcasting should have closed captions as well. And they also need to make sure that the information is accessible online and accessible through interpreters and closed captions. Any training offered to the community should have access set up and ready to go for deaf and hard of hearing people as well, with an interpreter or closed caption provided. And natural disaster centers, for instance, if a natural disaster happened and maybe someone needs help filling out the form, an insurance form, and make sure that it is accessible to deaf and hard of hearing community as well. Many emergency management groups set up during disaster relief what is called an N11. There's sometimes 211 and 311. But many of them do not have a texting option. But we encourage that as well, and to involve that in the function in their process.
This concludes Part 2. Part 3, Sight Translation. For this portion, you will interpret from written English. Your audience is a monolingual ASL user. You will have up to 2 minutes to read and comprehend the text. At the end of the 2 minutes, you will be prompted to begin the interpretation if you have not already begun. You will then have an additional 5 minutes to complete the interpretation. You will be prompted when the total time has elapsed. You will be interpreting a document as published by the National Notary Association. The document addresses the basic qualifications and requirements to becoming a notary public in Texas. This concludes your BES. Remember, this material should be considered confidential.